Hello and welcome to Anything But Ordinary with Spooky and Raven. Tonight's topic is a viewer's request, Haunted Asylums in Canada. I am your host, Spooky, and here is your other host, the most awesome Miss Raven.
Yeah, I hit the wrong music. I was trying to play something else. I don't know, so we just quickly transitioned over without the music part, but we don't do it every week, so you get distracted and forget how to run everything, and so, but that's what happens when you do live shows. You never know.
Yeah, well, that's true. You can't go back and redo them, not on a live show.
No, what you get is what you get, so.
That's right. What you get is what you get.
Yeah. Tonight's show is, going to be an interesting one, and I think, for sure.
Yeah, I got to be honest, I wasn't really that sure about it until I really got to looking into this stuff, and I was amazed at everything that we found.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff in Canada. Just so many. This is going to have to be a repeatable show.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
As far as asylums go in Canada, but not just asylums. There is a lot of things in Canada that we could talk about. From, cryptid to paranormal to alien stuff to interesting history stuff, But we were contacted by a viewer who was requesting if we could talk about the Charles Camsell Hospital. And they had contacted us a while back,
Actually, didn't they contact us more than once?
Yeah, and here's the thing, we write all of the requests down. And we don't go right down the list per se. We kind of jump around, but we are going to try our best to try to get to all of them. But we did get a whole bunch. We do get a whole bunch, and we really enjoy that you guys contact us and suggest this stuff to us. So if you did send us one, and it was a while ago, don't worry. We still plan on getting to them. But if you want, you can always re-suggest it too. To kind of bump it.
We have a really long list of viewer requests.
Yeah, plus the stuff that we want to do too. But tonight, not tonight, but I should say during my research on this hospital, the one that was requested for tonight specifically, that's why we're going to spend a lot of time on this one, is when I was researching it, it kind of took me down a lot of different roads of human history that was quite an eye-opener, and it was very disturbing to say the least, because I ran across certain times in history, and some of it not that long ago either, where there were these laws that were passed and certain procedures that were performed on people, and it wasn't just people who were in asylums either, and the things that have occurred not just in Canada but here in America and across the world too. It was very shocking, the things that I was stumbling on when I was trying to go deep into researching for this topic. But
absolutely, yes, they were. I was shocked, and it takes a lot to shock me.
I know. Yeah, for sure when it comes to you. But, this didn't, when we were doing this research and the things that we were coming across that kind of spider-webbed out, it inspired us for an upcoming show topic idea that we're going to be doing down the road, which we'll kind of mention a little bit in here during our show tonight when we're talking about the history and stuff. But it'll be something that we're going to end up needing to do on, because I think I wasn't even aware of certain laws that passed and certain things that happened in history because they don't talk about it, and it wasn't even that long ago, and I bet you a lot of people aren't even aware of it, and it should be kind of brought back up. But
well, some of the things we found, I can understand why they're not talked about and why it's not out there for people to know about.
Right. But both Spooky and I, we worked on research for two different hospitals tonight in Canada, and what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk about the history of these places and kind of what went on in the buildings, and then go in and talk about the supposed reports of paranormal activity that may have or is occurring there because of what took place in these facilities.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I lost my train of thought. I'm very sorry. But
that's okay.
Before the 1700s, though, those who suffered from mental illness, disabilities, and other conditions, they were mainly taken care of by family, or they were put into jails and poorhouses. There were no treatment or really any care for these people.
Oh, I know. I mean, basically, you were a throwaway. I mean, they would toss you toss you into these, overcrowded, I guess what you said, jailhouses, which were basically like these places or cages, and they'd keep you behind these bars all day long. And back then, for people, they didn't have the greatest sanitary conditions. They didn't have
No.
food or water, basically, or anything to protect you.
Not enough, anyway.
The elements or diseases. I mean, and if they weren't in the jails or with families, sometimes there was some religious people that would try to aid for people, but most of the time they would just be wandering around the streets. The history of mental health treatment in institutions all across the world could be a show topic in itself.
Oh, absolutely. I was really, really shocked at a lot of the treatments back then. But you have to stop and think too. There wasn't really enough known about mental illness back then, or how to treat it, or it was kind of like a trial and error thing. But what's disturbing was the things that people were being sent to these asylums for. I mean, your husband no longer wanted to be married to you, could commit his wife, or she could be, would be committed for desertion, an immoral life, woman trouble, reading books too much, laziness, snuff eating for 2 years. That was the one that really got me. Whatever you do, ladies, don't eat snuff
or
for
men.
2 years.
Yeah, well, see what you do.
Or men. That was for men too, not just women.
Basically, what you do is you eat snuff all the way up until the day before it hit the 2-year mark, and be like, "Hey, dude." You know what I mean?
Too late. Drinking, firefighting, of all things. And man, if you were someone who attempted to save people in a burning building or tried to help put out fires, you were considered crazy. Isn't that part of firefighting?
No, but
what is the sense in putting out a fire if you're not going to save anybody?
No, that back then. You're talking about back in the
I'm talking days. About back then, yeah.
But they also stuck orphans or kids who didn't have, or people who didn't want their kids would dump them off at these places as well. But
yeah,
there was
the list just really goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, it's true.
If those were the same standards for today, almost half the population, if not all of it, would be having vacation time in one of these places.
We'd be roommates.
Yeah. We'd be separated. They'd have you on a we might be roommates for a while, but pretty soon they'd have you on a building in one part of the place and me and way off in another.
They're like, we got to put her in a whole other continent. They cannot be together.
You. But why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I will. Tonight we're going to start with the specific one that was the viewer's request, was the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. Now this is located off of 115 Avenue Northwest, Edmonton. Now, back in 1906, there was this guy. His name was Bishop Emile. Now he basically wanted a Jesuit college to be put in the area, so he, asked the Jesuits to come to Edmonton and build a college. And it wasn't until like 1913 that a 3-story brick building was built, and it, basically operated as a private school for, I think, somewhere around 29 years for boys. And I think there'd be like 100 to 200 some students at one time, but I don't think it was strictly college level, because I was reading on different sites that they might have been teaching, elementary levels as well at this one school. But during the Great Depression is when things started to change, because, not just like us, but Canada was struggling with, they had unemployment, they had companies shutting down, farming prices would drop. And this was all like during the early 1930s for many years. And so the Jesuit schools' funding started to suffer greatly during that time. And they kind of went into debt, which caused them to have to put the place up for sale. And they ended up selling this facility in 1942 to the American Armed Forces, who ended up using this place for, kind of like their headquarters, or, for their personal or, civil engineers, because what was going on during that time is, of course, they were going to be constructing the Alaska Highway. And so what they did is they ended up building several redwood wooden barracks that kind of like encircled this 3-story brick building. And I guess it was on somewhere like 3 acres of land, or it was like 3 city blocks long, according to some sites, is what they were saying. I could be off a little bit, but I'm only going off of what I could dig up, you know what I mean? But there was more than, 10,000 American troops that were coming into Canada, and they were kind of like blazing through the wilds, creating this road over, 1,000 some miles long, trying to connect, the lower states to Alaska. And then sometime in like 1944 or 45, the whole place and all the equipment, what they ended up doing is they sold it to the Canadian government, and the American troops basically left and went back to the States, because it was during that time is when, the United States transferred control of the Canadian portion of the highway back over to, Canada's government or whatever. But so you kind of know the beginning part of how the buildings came about. But now this is where what they ended up doing is the building, the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, they ended up using this as their military hospital. Now, they ended up doing some more construction, and when they took the place over in their use, and they ended up adding like a few different buildings, and then they started connecting all the different buildings using like covered wooden corridors, you know what I mean? So you weren't always out in the elements or whatever. And it was in 1945 that the government ended up handing this facility over to IHS, who turned it into like a native hospital. Now, that actually didn't go over very well at first for many people who actually lived in the area at the time, because I guess they were like super pissed off, and I guess they felt it could have been used in a different way that best suited kind of like their selfish desires or whatever. But the government kind of told them like, hey, it's best used as, one of our segregated hospitals for the indigenous communities to kind of isolate any outbreak of TB or any other diseases or whatever from our regular public hospitals of Edmonton. This is the kind of conversations that I was reading about in public documents that they had and everything else. So during the 1800s, oftentimes, I think it was, mainly Christian missionaries or things like that who felt like they needed or wanted to go out and provide basic medical care to some of the different native tribes or whatever in the area. And it wasn't really until after the Second World War is when the Canadian government, I guess, started creating different segregated hospitals. And it's not just Canada. It happened in America too, you know what I mean? But they owned and operated, I think, somewhere around 22 facilities by the 60s. So that was like a lot, you know what I mean? I think anyway. But from what I was gathering from different sites anyway. But most of the time, the patients that were admitted weren't always sick. They were kind of brought in due to their Indian status. Because back in, I think, like the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the status or treaty natives were kind of considered wards of the government. And basically the government felt that they needed to dictate what these people needed or what they could do. It was kind of like they were controlling. You know what I'm saying?
Right. It was just a way of controlling them and assimilating them into what they thought was a
better way of living or whatever. You know what
I mean? Exactly.
Forced changes.
Civilized society.
Yeah, but this didn't just happen in Canada either. Like I'm saying, it was happening all over. But I'm just kind of sharing the history of what I discovered that was happening and going on during that time and in the hospital. And of course, at the end of every show, we'll be putting in links and references so you guys can go read more in depth than what we can normally get out in one show. But both the Royal Canadian Army Medical and the Indian Health Services operated this hospital together. Now, I guess TB was pretty bad during the 40s, and many government doctors and nurses and such, they would kind of travel across the Northwest Territory and other parts of Canada to these different remote villages, and they would basically start screening all the men and women and children for TB or other illnesses and such. And they would travel around with their different medical stuff and like portable x-ray machine and things like that, and anyone that they felt had TB or may have early signs, but didn't really have good testing to kind of prove that this person had it for sure. They would basically tell them, well, you have to leave, and they were taken away to one of these hospitals or to the Camsell Hospital. And oftentimes when I was reading about these people's experiences and everything else, they would come out onto these boats or anything like that, and they would be screened or tested in whatever fashion that these people deemed was, what they wanted to use. And then they weren't allowed to go back to the villages. They weren't able to say goodbye. They weren't able to grab personal items or anything. It was just, sorry, you're here, you got to go. And that was it. And then they were taken away. And these people, many times, the people who were in the village had no clue if the person who went out to, by the doctors, they didn't know.
So they could go on this place and just have a cough.
Mm-hmm.
And be taken away saying that they had TB.
Right. So those in the village and those who were out there on the boats or whatever, many times they didn't know or had any clue if they were going to return or not, So it was kind of intense for these people, emotional-wise, you know what I'm saying?
That's awful.
Yeah.
There really is. Those people had to be very upset and frightened. And the thing of it is, they probably didn't suffer from those diseases until
they were in the facilities.
They were exactly, because living off in their tribes and their villages,
their communities,
until settlers went in there and the government and everything went in, those people probably were hardly ever sick.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was all mandatory or not, but from what I was reading from all these different sites, it was implied as such, which I'm pretty sure it was. But sometimes if the patients were taken and their children were not, other people in the village would have to take in and care for them without even knowing if their parents would return. And some people who saw the planes or these boats coming, they would run off out of the village and hide just so they wouldn't, be brought in. But of course, these people were always tracked down and brought in anyways. And I guess during the years, according to, these different sites, there was between 5,000 to 14,000 people being taken into these hospitals and such.
Wow.
Give or take a year. Each year is a different amount. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, and there's so much more to all of this, but I'm trying to kind of shorten each little thing up and kind of put as much in as I can to kind of explain it so you understand why the place might be haunted. But the facility, the facility was fenced in at one point, okay? Because when they started bringing people in, of course, like I said, the public had an uproar. I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people, was having a stink about having these people come in. So basically, to appease them, they put this fence up, and so they would say, okay, so they can't kind of stay. They had to stay, and they wouldn't be wandering the streets, exposing others. You know what I mean? But for like a short time period, there were also veterans who were staying in the hospital, but they had their own separate area where they had their own beds and sections set aside just for them, so they were segregated from them as well. You know what I mean? But I guess they used the hospital for a good while until there was a new hospital that was built specifically for them. Was my understanding. But it was in December of 1945 when the first TB patients arrived. Now, in 1946, the hospital was named after a Dr. Charles Camsell, and the facility was transferred over to the Indian Department of Health and Welfare, and then I think it was opened up full operation of late August of 1946. Now, it wasn't until like 20 years later, I think, when the construction of the new hospital building was built in 1966, and that's the building that people see on 115th Avenue today. But from the years of 1946 and 1966, it had operated as a segregated hospital for the Aboriginals of Canada. Now, they had the 3-story brick building and the wooden buildings that were used for, like different wards of the hospital, and they were all, like I told you, connected by these, wooden covered corridors, you know what I mean? But one area they had for TB, another section was like for maternity and, pediatrics and such. And I think they said something like the second floor was used for like surgical ward, like a fourth floor was like the psychiatric wing, where they basically had like different isolation rooms, and they did like shock therapy treatment and other things. And I guess there was kind of like a playground area on the children's ward. They also kind of had like arts and crafts room where some patients would kind of like work on beaded work, painting, or wood carving and things like that. Stuff that they used to do at home, you know what I mean? But kind of have to do it here. Now, the photos that I found are up from the Camsell yearbook things, but it's almost feels like a lot of them, because the things that I read about, and then you see these photos, it's almost like they posed like, okay, let's just take some pictures. But I know that there was some good times going on here, but there was a lot of awful things that were going on too. But what the heck? I think there was, I remember, okay, there was, when they first opened, they had around 350 beds. But over the years, it kind of expanded to about 500. That was by the 1950s. And of course, at certain times, I'm having weird accents again. At certain times, they were over capacity, you know. But the Camsell Hospital staff, okay, they were both non-native and native individuals who were aiding the patients during the years of its operation. And now many of the native people, I guess, I hate terming people as something, because I just see everybody as one, you know what I mean? But many of them, they only worked like in the kitchen, the laundry, or, you know, like janitorial positions, or, you know, kind of like orderlies, or ward aides, or some of them were nurses, but most of them who were surgeons or doctors or the therapists and nurses, they were all mainly non-native. And sometimes those of who were patients at the hospital for years and years, when they ended up being released, they just sought work within the hospital because that's all they knew was the hospital, you know what I mean? Or also some family members of the patients, they would come in and try to take a job so that they could be close to their loved ones. But you know, both patients and staff members made statements that you could definitely see the difference in power status when it came to the staffing rights and whatnot. So basically, they were applying those of people who were, you know, of natives weren't treated or respected as much as the other people, you know what I mean, who worked there. That's what people are saying. Now, life within the hospital, from what I was reading, wasn't like the best experience for everyone staying there. Now, I had read some statements where people did experience, you know, like I said, some happiness while they were there, but many, many people did not. The hospital was, you know, overcapacitated. Oftentimes it was understaffed, so they didn't have enough people to help the people who were there. You know, patients were subjected to medical experimentations, you know, without the patient's consent. You know, oftentimes they had nutritional experiments done on them. They had shock therapy. They had painful surgeries for TB. What they mentioned was like people would go in and have their lungs cut open and scraped, and
oh my gosh,
and like ribs removed. And the doctors often would only use like local anesthetics on them. And they would be conscious while a lot of these different procedures were being, was happening to them. And these were kids too, not just adults. We're talking like babies to elderly, you know what I mean? So it was a wide range. So this was happening to even little kids, and they weren't even, only were having local anesthesia, like, how do you say that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then, when this would happen, then they'd be placed in a body cast at times. And they'd be up to a month or even a year. They would be stuck in a bed, unable to move, of their own accord. And when they came out of these body casts, a lot of times they were so weak that they had little to no muscle mass, that a lot of them talked about how they lost the ability to walk after several years of confinement. Because that's what it is. You're being confined in your bed forever, but
well, it's the same thing as being tied down to a bed. You just absolutely have no way of moving, not by yourself, and you're at the mercy of somebody coming in there and moving you. If you want to get in another position or something, you're at the mercy of someone else.
Oh yeah, but it's kind of worse because you're in a body cast, so like you can't do anything. But just imagine not being able to get up, use the facilities, and stinking and everything else, and like I said, they were understaffed. So what if they didn't get to you in time when you needed something? But people of all ages went through a series of these treatments for TBI. I'm talking about babies to teenagers to 10-year-olds. Like I'm saying, it wasn't people are thinking, oh, it's all adults, but there was a lot of children here, and they would go through these different treatment status things, depending on their condition or whatever they claimed they had, okay? But basically there was mandatory bed rest, and then later on they would have chemotherapy. But depending on their condition, they would be placed on these different daily, I guess you want to call it, like, routines. And like they're okay, let's say there was one, okay, if you're placed on this one type of routine or one status, basically you were forced to complete bed rest. You were only allowed out of bed once a month, and then that was like status 1. Let's say you're on routine 2 or whatever. You were allowed out of bed 2 to 3 times a day, but only for 10 to 15 minutes. Now, over time, as their condition status changed, so would their rules. But those who were on bed rest were not allowed to converse with anybody. They weren't allowed to read. They were told to remain silent and rest by the nurses who ran the floor. So that's people who are like on the main number 1 routine. They couldn't even talk. You just had to lay there. Period. You know what I mean? Now, someone stated that families could come in and fly, or, who could fly in, were only allowed to visit for an hour at a time. So you come a long way to come see your family member, and you're only allowed to see them for 1 hour a day. I couldn't handle that, especially if they took my baby
and some of them
or my child or whatever.
From remote places.
Right, and it's very costly. But they said, a lot of times the children were spanked or they were physically strapped down to their beds because they were too rowdy, okay? But what little kid do you know can sit still for hours and hours a day?
Well, they weren't being allowed to be children. You're not going to get a child, unless that child is really, really sick, you're not going to get a child to sit still very long. And it makes you wonder, like Cassandra made a point in chat, how many of these people went in there, they had a cough. Maybe it was a cold, maybe it was just, they coughed a couple times. And then they were sent in there around people who really were sick, who really had TB. And then contracted the disease.
Well, there was cases where, and I know, like, I know medical technology changes over the time. I can see chat once in a while, and I see Rusty's comment or whatever. But I'm talking about the history of what was going on during this time period, because I did a lot of research and digging and reading about the things and it didn't just happen in Canada; it happened in a lot of places too. But they were talking about how, there was documented cases of the hospital staff putting casts on these kids' legs so that they would follow the rules, that they wouldn't get out of bed. You know what I mean? And not just kids, but, older people too. But, many
kids have to get up and move, though. I mean, kids cannot
everybody
sit
has to.
Still. Well, everybody does, but especially kids. I mean, they have all that energy, and unless you weight them down or tie them down, you're not going to keep them down.
Well, right. And a lot of people who ended up going in here didn't have TB. But they kept them there anyway because they could.
But they were probably exposed to it because people in there probably, did have it.
Well, yeah, I know. But a lot of people, because of the status, and like I said, they were wards of the government, were kept here and experimented on. But many babies and young children, they ended up being placed in foster homes or they were adopted out during the 60 scoop because they weren't returned back to their families or their communities. Instead, the hospital was adopting these people's kids out, and not always to somebody of their own heritage. You know what I mean? And that's the whole thing you can read about the 60 scoop. That was pretty intense reading about that, But I had to focus back on the hospital. But there were psychological, there was physical, and sexual abuse that happened often to people of all ages. There was little kids that were talking about how, these people would come in who worked in the facility would, sexually assault kids of all ages and also older people, you know what I mean? And they couldn't do anything about it. But because most of the people who stayed in this hospital, they all spoke different language, from the staff oftentimes. So they didn't understand what or why the things were happening or what they were possibly even agreeing to. You know what I mean? Because they didn't understand. There was a language barrier.
Language barrier, yeah.
Now I'm just, I know they tried. There was some people there who could, but like I said, it was there's more people than there was staff, and if anybody who's ever worked in a hospital, even today, it's still really hard because you have people coming in, whatever, but this was kind of different for then. But these hospitals, they didn't offer them the things that they were used to either, like their holistic medicines and treatments that they were used to, or midwives and stuff. But they were kind of forced into the Western practices, and that they had to assimilate their traditional ways for the changing times. So, and it was also uncomfortable for them too, because they were being forced to do different things that they weren't
things they weren't used to and didn't understand,
or their belief system or whatever. There was also forced sterilization. Camsell Hospital was one of the largest facilities that did the most, I guess, from what I was reading from different sites, did the most as far as sterilization going, because back in 1928, the Sexual Sterilization Act passed that gave permission and allowed both hospitals and native schools to sterilize women, children, and men. And, the principals back then were the legal guardians of the students, and both the school and the hospital could force people to be sterilized. And they had this eugenics law, which wasn't only in Canada, because it was a law in the United States too, that forced not only natives, but many others as well. And, of course, we're going to be talking about that in upcoming show topics about the sterilization law, because we didn't realize that happened. It didn't happen that long ago here. It still kind of occurs too. But
I didn't know anything at all about the eugenics law until I was researching these. Well, you mentioned it, and then as I was researching into this, it came up several times actually.
Right, but the crazy, because they had a lot of what was it? Oklahoma we were talking about. Remember they had the schools. They had a lot of Indian schools down there in Oklahoma, and but they were doing it there too. But they were in Canada. All the native. I hate saying all these different words because I don't want to be offending anybody. But you know what I mean. These schools, they were sterilizing and doing experiments on the children too, not just in the hospitals. Right. But I can't even imagine going through half this stuff. And you're being taken out of your community, forced to go somewhere you have nowhere to go, don't understand half the language that somebody's probably saying. You don't know, if you're ever going to go home, which most people never did, and then going through all these different type of experiments that they felt they needed to use to advance whatever medical technology or psychological technology or whatever. And then, to be sterilized, because many of the women were forced to have hysterectomies done on them, and the doctors would often tell them, like, oh, we're doing this because you might have cancer, but none of them ever had cancer. Now, many
might have.
Yeah, but none of them. They didn't have, you know what I mean? There wasn't...
Right.
Whatever. But, many people were, like I said, brought into these hospitals against their will. And from what I was reading, because of the Indian Act, that they had no choice. They had to be subjected to these treatments and this health care, because if they refused to see a doctor or to go to the hospital or even try to leave these places, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would come and arrest them and bring them back to these places until they were rightly discharged, or they would just stick them in jail forever long. You know what I mean?
So they were basically detained there for however long the hospital deemed fit. They were subjected to whatever treatment or experiments they wanted to perform on them, and they had absolutely no say. And they probably, when they were going through these sterilization procedures, probably had no idea what they were. And you might have cancer is not reason enough for a hysterectomy.
Yeah, but I want to do one topic on the schools too, and you know what I mean, because of things that happened there. Because I was reading about this, and then it branched me off to neighboring things that was going on at the same time. And I'm not trying to trash Canada, because it was happening all over the world too.
Yes, it was.
Okay?
Even in the United States,
Yeah.
it sure was.
Big time. But I just forgot my thought. But there was a lot of messed up things going on, and the things that I was reading about, and there was more just the messed up laws and how people would agree to allow these things to happen was insane. But basically, you know, a lot of times when these doctors would go out to the villages back then, they didn't really have, you know, like reliable tests to really confirm if somebody had TB or not via, you know, through these skin tests or, you know, x-ray machines or whatever. And people who came to the hospital would end up not having like TBI, and like I said, they would remain in these hospitals and they would go through these weird treatments and experiments anyway. They would still cut into them and do all this stuff. And you know, some patients at one point were allowed to go home, okay? But the ones who were allowed to go home, sometimes they were dropped off at the wrong place. And by the time they did go home, they didn't even know their own native language anymore and had a hard time assimilating back into the community. You know, and other people, they stayed for years and years and years, and you know, they just felt it like a home. They came as a child and stayed there forever, you know, or they'd be transferred from between hospitals, you know. And of course, you know, some died due to their illness or the ill treatments that happened to them, because I mean, that's what happens in hospitals. People are born and they die, you know what I mean? But
exactly.
But because of how the hospital kept their records back in that day, many family members were unaware of their loved ones passing on or where their final resting place was, you know. And from what I was reading, there were very few who ended up passing ever did return home to their community or to their loved ones because of the cost, but also they were buried in unmarked graves in different
That is so sad.
places. Yeah. Now, there was a lot of people who were talking about that there being possibly a burial site on the southeast corner of the property that was used for one of the mass grave sites, while other people talked about being a student at the nearby native residential schools to the hospital, where they were actually forced to bury patients who were brought over and dropped off. And I'm not talking about like older people or whatever. They had to bury babies and little kids and teenagers, people of all ages, you know. Now, true or not, I'm not going to state one way or the other, but this is what people were talking about. And it's mentioned a lot in different things. So, and there is a grave site over where one of the schools used to be. So I'm pretty much thinking it's true, you know. But these school children were the caretakers of the cemetery grounds. And when the school closed, I think like in the late 60s, there was this group, I think they were called the Pound Makers Lodge or whatever. It was kind of like near the property. They kind of took over the upkeep. And then it was later on transferred over to the city of Edmonton, who, from what I was kind of reading, didn't really do anything. They just left it. So it overgrowed up with grass, you know, wild field type of looking thing. And then at one point, I guess, a fire occurred there, and it ended up damaging some of the grave markers that were placed there, you know, over time, because somebody ended up putting some there. But I guess they were like wooden crosses that were placed on some of the graves. And like I said, many of them were kind of destroyed by this wild grass fire. And then the ones that kind of remained that didn't end up, you know, being destroyed, I guess sometime in the 80s, someone decided to come along, pick up all the crosses that were still there and toss them all in a pile, you know?
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I'm talking about massive disrespect. I don't care where you come from. That's just jacked up. You know what I mean?
I can't stand anybody who mismanages a cemetery.
Yeah, but it wasn't.
That's just a sore spot with me.
But it's not even a designated cemetery. It was like a school. The hospitals would come and dump these bodies off and leave the kids to dig graves for them. And you know what I mean?
It was still a cemetery of sorts.
I know, but I mean, it's not like a regular cemetery where
not a designated cemetery.
Paid to keep up and stuff like that. You know what I'm trying to say? But later on, there was a some people who came around. I can't remember the name, so I apologize. There's a lot of information to try to retain and put out there. But they ended up building like this monument, or like a, what do you call it? You know, when you put a whole bunch of stones together to make like a cairn or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was put in St. Albert Municipal Cemetery, which was in the section where it's put in was like a part of the old school area where they had the patients. But anyway, they have this thing there where it only has 98 patients' names listed that were from the Camsell Hospital that were buried there between the 40s and the 60s. And on the plaque, there's like a plaque on each side of the stone thing that's got all the different names. And I guess it says their name, but half the names aren't even right anyway. Because I was reading when these people were going into these hospitals that they would change your name on you. They would change your name, give you another name, and give you a number, and that's who you are. Okay? So not only did you lose your family, you lost your home, you lost your tradition,
you lost your identity,
you lost your native tongue, you were forced to assimilate over, you were abused, and then you lost your name, God, or whatever they call, your name, So there was a lot of things that were going on. Or you had your hair cut, or a lot of things, But anyway, on these little plaques, they would have the person's name, I guess, and their age of when they died, and there was a lot of young people. But that's only 98 patients. Whereas, there isn't, there should be a whole lot more things listed for these people. But there is a group of people out there that are working at trying to locate family members who had passed away in these hospitals to bring some kind of closure, and such to them. But it's not, that's like a very daunting task to do,
Mm-hmm.
Because there's not good records kept during many years of this operation. And while I was trying to do research on those who died in the hospital, I did come across a lot of disturbing things of how there were mass graves of children in Canada in a lot of these former native residential schools and such. And they were basically showing how all this genocide all across Canada, and it wasn't just Canada, okay? I'm not knocking Canada. It's happening all over the world too. But how there is this huge genocide that was taking place all across Canada, and how it's being hidden for years and years and years, and they're trying to fight to bring this information to light, which basically is in 2012, 2014 was when they were really pushing this. And I'm going to end up posting a link, for you guys if you want to go read more about that. But apparently, the government and certain Indian, I don't know what you call it, the people who are higher up who kind of sold their soul to work with the government, okay, are trying to cover up this and don't want the graves to be found, and they're fighting people and suing people because they don't want this dark part of Canada coming out. But all this should come out so we don't repeat history, right? But
right.
Apparently, the government was aware of all of these allegations of abuse and these medical experiments that were being done in these facilities, and that people were dying under, I guess, dubious circumstances. And they weren't dying strictly from TB. Of course, some of them did, but a lot of them were dying of, other forced causes and experiments.
Right.
You know what I mean? But if basically was what they were saying is like, we don't care.
They were turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to it, is exactly what they were doing.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, we knew it was happening, but, it's not our problem. It is what it is, so move on. You know what I mean? And sometime in the 70s, the hospital was no longer used strictly to treat TB, but it was opened up to treat, the general population. And it operated as such, I think, up until the early 90s, like 93, 92 or whatever. But I forgot what you said. You were mentioning something about how every time somebody would go in there, if they didn't have something, they would end up being exposed. But yeah, because they didn't have a lot of space, people were forced into by people who had...
Well, they were overcrowded.
Yeah, but they were forced into areas where people had could be exposed and catch different type of whatever. You know what I mean? And I'm sorry, that I forgot to I know you said that a few times, and I can't remember if I ever replied to your comment or not, but yes, that did happen. It did happen a lot, but like I said, ended up switching over to kind of like treat general population, and it operated there for I think in 93 or whatever, until the facility was kind of shut down and then the doors were closed. Now, this hospital has sat vacant for like a long time, and they couldn't tear it down, you know, because a lot of residents were like, oh, this is like an eyesore, you know, it's ugly, it could be such better something done here, but it can be torn down because they have all that asbestos in it, I guess. Now, it did have different owners through the years, and they were wanting to convert this building into different things and apartments and such. And then there's this one company, or whoever it was, Dub, they ended up purchasing this place in 2004. And, you know, of course, they had to go through all this government, you know, when you have to get all these different AOKs to do this, that, whatever, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. While they were working on it and everything else, I guess there was a slight fire that occurred in the building, I guess in 2006, when some of the construction guys were working on it. But they ended up like putting like barbed wire on it and fencing and everything in certain spots to stop people and homeless people from going in there, or people wanting to just explore abandoned buildings, you know. And so the firefighters ended up not being able to really get into parts of the building because a lot of stuff was blocked off from people snooping in there, you know, so they had to do a lot of the firefighting from outside or whatever. But I guess construction is and has been going on in this hospital, and they've been trying to turn it into residential condos, I guess. There's going to be like 300 different type of condos, 200 on the main site and 89 on the south side or whatever. And, I guess they're saying that units are going to be ready this year in 2018 for residents to purchase and move into this. Now, true or not, I don't know. I'm just going off of all the different sites and newspaper articles and everything else. But there is a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of all the former patients that were in these government-run hospitals, segregated hospitals. And there's over 29 segregated hospitals that are listed in this lawsuit. So that's a lot, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, because of the different things that have occurred in the area because I was, you know, what I really was trying to do before I got into the history of what was going on when it was a hospital, I wanted to see, you know, what took place when it ran 29 years as a Jesuit college. Because it makes you wonder, did anything happen during the years that they had operated it? Because obviously it's they're very spiritual, and there are spiritual lessons going on, so it makes you wonder about the energy coming from that, and then coming when it was the hospital, and energy that was going on in the hospital with life and death and all the emotional trauma and stuff, you know what I mean? And I wanted to find out more, and I found a couple links that talked about the Jesuit college, but it didn't give a whole lot, but I'm going to put it in references if you guys want to go read more in depth than what I'm talking about. But like I said, because of the different things that had occurred in this area while it was in operation, you know, people say this place is haunted. You know, people have talked about, also while people were in the hospital, while it was still open, talked about having paranormal experiences, because people had talked about when...
I don't doubt it.
People had talked about when they were in there that they had saw full body apparitions and things, you know what I mean? And a little girl said she saw her mom, but her mom was never there. But her mom must have passed over, came and visited her or something, you know what I mean? And now there's a link that I'll be posting there too, where a bunch of people who were from the hospital commented on this page, and they were sharing their stories. But I can't sit here and tell all their stories, you know what I mean? But I'm going to post it in the references tonight so you guys can go and read their personal experiences. But people have talked about being feeling of being watched, you know, when they were in this facility. Also from the outside, when you're walking around on the outside, it would seem like somebody was watching you from the windows and stuff. People talk about hearing screams and cries and people hollering for help and stuff. And there's people who've gone into this place, and they talked about how they've recorded screams off of the 4th floor and recorded people calling for help and crying and stuff. They have EVPs of that. They talk about seeing glowing lights from the outside. You know, they talk about seeing shadow entities, which I think is a norm for a hospital. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
People talk about hearing disembodied footsteps or voices and screams. The screams, that would really get to me, or hearing children cry.
That would definitely get to me.
Because if they're forced to be awake to go through these experiments and being cut open and scraped at and bones cut out, and could you imagine visualizing and watching this, as a young person?
I don't even want to think about it.
The emotions, that's just embedded into this buildings and ground alone.
And the fear.
Yeah. And
from it. And, watching this, especially children, the absolute terror that the children must have felt.
The repeated sexual abuse over and over again. And you're just like a little 5-year-old, 8-year-old or whatever. This was, you know what I mean? And it was talked about a lot. And just being a little kid. Imagine being 5 years old and some stranger comes into your community, into your home, and swoops you up. You don't understand what they're talking about, and they take you away, and all your other family's not with you. And then you're going through all these things.
Not to mention the fact that your family doesn't even know what happened to you, where you're at. You're gone for years and years, I mean, and I'm sure that hundreds of them died not knowing where their family were.
Yeah, but okay, not to mention a lot of them were shipped off and adopted out, without permission. Yeah. But and they're still alive. But that energy or those feelings are imprinted in this building. Okay, but with the hospital, I'm assuming there would be a lot of residual and intelligent haunting going on because of the life and the death and all the emotions, like I said, occurred here. But you also have reports and claims of people talking about I don't know, they're just seeing lots of things. Okay, you know what I mean? But yeah. What hospital kind of isn't? But I can totally understand why this one is. But the fact that many of these people's bodies weren't returned home or to their loved ones, but they were just dumped somewhere in an unmarked grave, or even had a temporary marked grave, which didn't last. You know what I mean? Didn't have your name on it or anything. But I can see why their spirit isn't at rest, because each tribe has their own special burial customs to help their loved ones cross over to the underworld. And
right.
Each one has the unique. They each have their unique specific rituals and blessings that occur. And it might go longer than just an hour, a day, or it could go for a week. You know what I mean? And they have to do this whole process, and that's their because we each have our own unique thing that each family does. And since many of these families and these patients were denied that right, it caused a lot of distress in the communities back home, and I'm sure for the spirit of the person who passed. And since this place, I don't know, that's just upsetting, just how the people were treated through the whole process, and not even to have the respect paid. I'm hoping that the children said something over these people.
Well, it was like their beliefs and their rituals and everything just were nothing. Just absolutely nothing. They weren't important.
Yeah.
And they had these ceremonies and these rituals for, to make sure that their loved one's spirit crossed over and was at rest.
Well, this place is privately owned. There is security service that's actively patrolling the facility, and if people try to get in, you're going to be fined or, ticketed or go to jail. But for those who worked in the hospital, like the demolition crew, the hospital people, or patients and stuff, or, to paranormal groups that somehow got access to this place, or to people passing by and they snuck in, one way or the other, have all talked about seeing and or experiencing something dealing with the paranormal when it comes to this hospital. And, like I mentioned earlier, there were people that had happy times here in this facility, and not all the staff or the workers who worked there were cruel, okay? Because there were people who truly loved the patients there and they actually did help those who were staying there in the hospital, okay? But like life, there are good apples and there are bad apples in this world. So I don't want to say like everybody who was in this hospital went through something super, super horrible. And I'm not saying everybody who worked there was a complete prick, because that's not true. Because there were some people who were there who probably did not agree with what was going on. They probably tried to fight it. There was others who just shut their mouth and just, tried to do their best to bring what little love they could to these people. You know what I mean?
Right.
Now, I will be posting, like I said, in our references after the show ends tonight, links where you guys can see more photos of the Camsell yearbooks, of the patients and buildings and all that such. And go and read more things that we kind of stumbled on that I kind of had to shorten up because we only have so much time in a show.
Right.
Because we both work and got to do stuff in the morning too. But, yeah. I know this was requested by a viewer a few times. And usually you don't know what you're going to come across. Because I was unaware of this facility because I don't live in the area. I don't know anything about it. But because we try to do our best to really dig deep and find as much as we can. And just all the different energy and the people and the things that have gone through this building alone, I can totally understand what's going on. I mean, first it was used as a spiritual college. Then it was used by military people, so who knows what they were doing. And then it was used as an experimental hospital, basically, where it seemed like they didn't give a rat's patootie about anybody, so.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you to the viewer who requested us to do this tonight. I learned a whole lot.
Absolutely.
And not did I learn a whole lot about the things that were going on in Canada, but it ended up opening my eyes to a lot of things that happened here in America that are going to let us do other topics about dark history and things that had happened to people. So, do you want to take a 3-minute break?
Yeah, we're gonna take a quick break, and we should be back in about 3 minutes.
Yeah, I need to get a drink of water. That was like a lot of talking. So, we'll be back in 3 minutes. You guys stay with us, and then Spooky's gonna talk about her pick, and share us with others, and we'll be back for the second hour. Welcome back to Anything But Ordinary with Spooky and Raven. Tonight's topic is haunted asylums in Canada. We just got done talking about the Camsell Hospital. It was a viewer's request. And thank you for that. I learned a lot. Somebody wanted to know what the song we played. It was called Remember Me. I thought it was kind of fitting for tonight. You know what I mean? For all the people and the things that they went through. But Spooky's back with us. And
Yep.
Like we said, we're always, in our references, we're going to have more. You guys can always go and read more and everything. I just think you should. And there's going to be more pictures. There's so many pictures that we couldn't show, you know.
Right.
So, I don't know. Any more thoughts on that? I had a lot to say. I don't know. You just kind of didn't really say anything a whole lot, but I didn't know if
Well, I was
anything
just
you
sitting
kinda
and
wanted to add in.
I was just sitting and listening to you, and I was just amazed at all the things that happened there. It was just unbelievable.
There was photos of the 98 patients memorial thing that was put up. I found it on Find a Graves, and also somebody on Facebook had it. I did ask permission, but I guess they never came back on Facebook in time to reply to me or not. I really wanted to show that, but I wish that there was something more done. And I think the people who ended up purchasing this place and they're turning it into these apartments or whatever, they did talk about making one section have like a nice little garden, and they're going to make something to memorialize those who passed over. But I think, what is that technology that they have where you can, because they use it on, when they were trying to find, what's those guys who were, that heat, or whatever, you know, ground reading radar, or whatever they call that. What do you call that? You know, where you can...
Ground penetrating radar?
Yeah, I'm sure if, somebody could come by, use that, and they would find the disturbances that are down layered in the ground and probably locate a lot of it, because I just think it's disrespectful to tear up the ground and everything else, knowing that there are probably
literally hundreds of bodies down there, but 98 are all that were mentioned.
Yeah, and they didn't even have their names spelled right, or practically the people's right names, because like I said, a lot of these hospitals made people have different names. They were just like called Annie 011111256, you know?
Right.
Thanks for nothing, you know?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, do you want to go into your pick that you chose?
Yeah, I will. I had a lot of trouble deciding which one I was going to do, and I finally settled on Tranquille Sanitarium in Kamloops, British Columbia.
Yeah.
And that was also known as Padova City, and it's located at 4600 Tranquille Road in Kamloops, British Columbia. Now, this place was built in 1907 to treat tuberculosis, and it opened its doors for residents in November of that same year. Now, it was managed by the British Columbia Anti-Tuberculosis League, I can't even talk, and was under the direction of a Dr. Charles Fagan. Now, TB was also known as the White Plague, and it was rampant at the time, and it was also known as a wet disease. Now, so it was decided that Kamloops was the ideal place to build this sanitarium. I personally cannot understand why, because back then the treatment for TB was plenty of fresh, dry air, and this place was built on a 191-acre tract, and it was built alongside a lake. Anywho,
wait, what did you say about the fresh air part? Sorry, you were talking so fast, so...
It was... tuberculosis was the treatment for tuberculosis was plenty of fresh, dry air.
Yeah.
You know, like you find down in like Arizona.
Right, and because of the lake, you have moisture in the
and
air.
And they built it right. Yeah, they built it right along a lake. Exactly. And part of TB is there is a wetness in your lungs. It's fluid building up.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Fagan and the BCAL had plans for this place, big plans for this place. And by 1950, it consisted of 40 buildings, 3 of them being hospitals. That's when it became Padova City, because this was a city within a city.
Oh, so they made like their own segregated
their own
city.
little town.
Yeah,
their own little town. And it was actually located 13 miles from Kamloops. But anyway, there were cottages to house the doctors. There was a fire hall. There was a kitchen that could feed over 1,000 people. Farm buildings, a laundry, a dairy barn, a nurse's building, gardens, and just about any other kind of workplace that you can imagine for the time. And underneath it all were tunnels that connected the buildings. Now, these tunnels were used to transport food and laundry and supplies and even dead bodies to the morgue. And the bodies were transported through the tunnels so they would not upset the patients by seeing this.
Some people in chat are saying, like, BC doesn't have dry, it's not the norm.
I didn't think so. But anyway, from 1907 to 1950, over 1,600 people died there. Now,
I'm sure more.
I'm sure, well, this is from 1907 to 1950, and I'm sure that people did die there from their tuberculosis because this was mainly a spa for sick people.
Yeah, but 1907 to 1950, only 1,000 people died in the hospital.
1,600.
Oh, sorry.
But still,
the place. Really low.
Well, that is really when you stop and think about it. The place was self-sufficient, and cattle and pork and honey were the largest products produced, and they were produced in surplus. So this allowed for trade with outside businesses. And this place even prospered during World War I and World War II. After these wars, a lot of soldiers returned home, not only in Canada, but, in the United States and other places. A lot of soldiers returned home infected with TB. Mm-hmm. And by 1946, there were 85 veterans in residence here, and that made up about 24% of the residents. Now, Tranquille did become a large-scale operation, and it was completely modernized for the time, and this included air conditioning, which is really good for tuberculosis.
I'm sorry, but this sounds... I think it's cool that they could function during the wars and stuff, because a lot of places can't and didn't and failed. So that's kind of cool. But the fact that they're basically pumping these people full of not the right environment for TB anyway.
No, it wasn't. But back then they really didn't know a lot about it. The residents who wanted to work were given jobs, and those who did not could stroll around at their leisure. This
at
was
least
like,
they could walk around.
The place was actually well organized. At the time, it was a sanitarium. It was like a spa, and at its peak, it housed over 500 residents plus the staff.
Now, this wasn't a segregated one, was it?
No, it wasn't segregated, but there were a lot of wealthy people there at the time.
So that's why their treatment was different. They could wander around, do whatever they wanted, whereas the one I was talking about, they were basically treated like prisoners.
Well, unfortunately for Tranquille, a cure for tuberculosis was found in, I think it was 1956. And by 1958, it closed its doors because it was no longer needed. Mm-hmm. Now, in July of 1959, it reopened as a mental facility under the Department of Mental Health to ease the overcrowding of other facilities and asylums.
Well, now we know why it was into it. Now you know why it was overcrowded, because they tossed anybody and their grandma into these places. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Go
ahead.
And this place housed all levels of mental illness and had patients from infants to adults. And that is because the place became a dumping ground for British Columbia's unwanted, which meant abandoned babies, orphans, epileptics, hyperactive individuals, intellectually challenged people, physically challenged people, wards of the state, and the criminally insane.
Well, also you have all the other things that we talked about earlier,
Right. But I should mention here, though, that there are reports from parents claiming that they did not give up their children willingly. they claimed that they were coerced by local authorities and the government to give up their children. And these were the children, like I said, that were physically and intellectually challenged. They were hyperactive. They were epileptics, and it wasn't just children, that had these particular so-called symptoms. There were some adults that had them too.
Well, what is classified as hyperactive? Because you opened your mouth. Oh, you're hyperactive. My wife's going into the facility because she breathed wrong and I didn't like her eggs and bacon. I mean, basically everything we read about I'm getting a weird accent. Everybody was shoved in there for one reason or the other, and they took them because they wanted the money that they would receive in these facilities.
Yeah. And you also have to remember, too, that the children and unwanted adults were housed in the same building as the criminally insane and others with different levels of mental illness, but on different floors. They had a pediatric ward, and on down. And, even though they were different floors, it was still the same building. So people, these patients and inmates could wander basically around just about anywhere. But it's not that mattered, because it still led to abuse and in some cases murder.
Well, yeah, because you're sticking people in with people who really have something wrong with them and will physically act out,
So this was not only a combination mental illness facility, it was also, you might as well basically say, an orphanage.
Right.
But
most of them were.
Yeah, that's true. And some of the staff were not properly trained in mental illness, and they didn't know that, like, some forms of aggression was a way of communicating by some of the nonverbal patients. So this led to beatings of these particular patients on a daily basis. In 1972, the staff became unionized. And with this job security measure, the accountability and discipline of the staff for mistreatment of the patients was almost non-existent, thereby making rudeness, negative treatment, and downright abuse of these patients a common practice. Now, I'm not saying that all of the staff were abusive, because they were not. This was a small number of them that were. But also, a lot of the abuse was patient on patient and patient on staff. Like in the 1960s, 2 patients killed a nurse in one of the tunnels. There was sexual abuse by both staff and patients, and the patients that would bite, whether they were children or adults, the institution would have all of their teeth pulled out.
That's normal, though. That was happening. It still happened. No, probably still kind of happening. But you remember that show I don't know how it came about. Somehow we came up talking about something because we ran across a YouTube video that was talking about Geraldo Rivero, who went into some insane asylum that happened, in the 80s or whatever, and they were showing how these people were just in their own feces and everything else, and how they were having their...
I don't think it was him, but somebody took a hidden camera in with them. Yeah, I remember that.
Geraldo Rivero, because I think that was when it was just beginning. Yeah, the guy with the big mustachio.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't he the guy with the big mustachio and you're like, oh...
And the big nose, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I was super, super little. But, I remember, looking at some YouTube thing that we came across, and he was showing, and they snuck him, because this is before he got huge, but I think it helped him get huge. And they were showing the conditions. So it's not just back in the day. It's still happening. And they're still pulling teeth out, and they're, still abusing these people. And it's not just these insane asylums, but, old folks' home, too,
Yeah, exactly. People were being tied to the toilets and hot water poured on their genitals to make them go.
Oh, my gosh.
Reports of experiments being conducted on the patients. Over-medication to make them easy to control. Murder committed by both patients and staff. And by this time, the place had 800 patients plus staff. So another 1,600 people died here during its time as a mental institution. In 1972, there was this nurse named Marie White.
Mm-hmm.
She complained to the administration about the over-medicating, and she also reported a janitor who was sexually abusing children. And absolutely nothing was done. There was no action taken, no disciplinary action.
No
I can't
firing
talk.
or nothing. Yeah.
Nothing.
See, that's what I thought was happening at the other hospital. Like I said, there was some good people, and they probably spoke up like you're saying this lady did.
I'm sure some did.
They were probably fired or, harassed.
Well, wait till you hear what happened to Miss White.
Okay.
Okay, so nothing was done, so she complained again. And this time she threatened to go to the media. So you want to know what happened to her?
Yeah, we all do.
Well, one day another nurse approached her and said she did not look good and she must be ill, so she had to go to the office for an examination. And there she was taken into this office, and they drugged her and they transported her to another facility to be committed. This woman was drugged, she was abducted, she was imprisoned, and she was reported to be insane. And all of this without commitment papers, just to keep their dirty little secret.
What? And so basically what they did is they probably kept her over-medicated the whole entire time. But did she not have, I know, but didn't they not have family members, or was she?
Well, fortunately for Miss White, her daughter found out and with the help of a lawyer rescued her mother. Well, Miss White sued and she won. She won back pay and she was reinstated, but she never went back to work at Tranquille. And I'm guessing that she was smart enough to know that if she did, her life there would be a living hell.
It already is a living hell.
Now, if they would do this to a nurse, imagine what they were doing to the patients. In 1984, though, due to budget cuts, the place was closed. Mm-hmm. Now, 400 patients were released to either halfway houses or outright released onto the streets and forgotten. And Kamloops was overrun with homeless.
So that's normal, okay? It still kind of happens because when there's these facilities that were closing down, even around here in my state, and not that long ago, these people who have no family, no nothing, they basically said, you got to leave. We're closing the building. Bye. They got nothing. They're pushed out on the streets.
A lot of places.
And these people would just live there on the grounds or be arrested or died because they didn't have anybody to take care of them because they didn't know how to take care of themselves.
No, they were. Some of these people that were released onto the street were had been there since they were children.
Yeah.
And orphans and stuff, or unwanted children, and this place didn't offer any training at all. Mm-hmm. None. And so they're released out onto the streets. They don't know where to go. They had no idea.
They don't know about money. They don't know how to do jobs. They don't know how to take care of themselves.
They don't know about money. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to work. The only thing that they knew was this institution. Mm-hmm. That was it. And a lot of the people, I forgot to mention though, a lot of the people that died there, mm-hmm. they were buried in unmarked graves.
Mm-hmm. A lot of them were just dumped. Yeah.
Well, a lot of them were. Now, like when it was tuberculosis sanitarium, the people that died there, they were sent back to their families because, after all, they were paying customers.
Well, they're rich families,
so to speak.
Yeah.
But when it was a mental hospital, they were buried on the grounds. Unless family claimed them, they were buried on the grounds in unmarked graves. So there are a lot of unmarked graves at this place still to this day.
Well, usually they were buried
and nobody has done anything about it.
Yeah, they were usually buried by other patients who worked on the grounds,
Right.
A lot of these hospitals that we end up talking about when we do different haunted states, a lot of time it's the patients who are, because they're cooking the food, the certain ones who were cooking, doing the laundry for everybody or burying the patients.
Mm-hmm. And the thing of it was, when this mental institution opened up,
Mm-hmm.
this place was already built up. It had a laundry facility. It had a large kitchen. It had a dairy barn,
Yeah, because of all the
huge
rich.
gardens and stuff, but that was back when it was the sanitarium. When it became a mental hospital,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the buildings weren't even used. They did nothing to train any of these people.
So they had the facility and room space
They
so that
had the
people wouldn't.
facility to do it, they just didn't do it.
Right, but they also had more space for people if they wanted
They
to
had
make
more space.
No, listen. They also had more space if they wanted to make more bedding. But instead of opening
Exactly.
these buildings up, they kept them all stuffed into one corner. So that's disgusting as well. No, was this government ran then by that time? This time?
Well, by this time it was ran by the Department of Mental Health, but
Yeah,
that's a government agency.
Stupid government. I'm not saying that
So
just to Canada. I'm saying all government-run things all
Yeah,
over
it's
the
not
world.
just there. That's
here
down here too.
Yeah, and
That's
across
a lot of
country,
there's a lot
world.
of facilities in the United States.
in the world.
In northern Illinois, did you know that there's a brand new prison built there that cost the taxpayers a lot of money, and it was built something like 10 years ago, and that prison still has yet to see one prisoner. They have never used it.
We could be
This
like
place-
you could be like the conspiracists and say, well, they're waiting until they do. They're gonna round us all up and put us in there. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, really.
talk about a waste
But-
of money.
A lot of this place was wasted.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously
you
they
know.
didn't give two flying. They just
And
wanted
the
the
thing
money.
of it was, it didn't sit empty very long either. It only sat empty for like a year. So by the time they were using it as a mental hospital,
Mm-hmm.
the buildings were still in great shape.
I think they downsized it because the less money going into paying for electricity, whatever else, and then they just kept taking all these people in, and all they cared about was the money, not the people. But there, like you said, there were some good apples there and some bad apples. But.
Oh, there were a lot of good staff there, from what I read. There was just there were a few that were bad apples, and the problem was when they unionized. Of course, the union backs their members and everything, and a lot of the abuse and stuff went unchecked.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want to deal with the union. Because in a lot of cases, the union wins. And not only, now the other 400 patients they were sent to other institutions, and the staff found employment elsewhere. But those other 400, you got to figure they were probably criminally insane, or they had legitimate mental illnesses and stuff. Because I'm guessing the ones that were not as bad off were the ones that were released onto the streets.
No, but listen, that's not really how it happens. Because when you go into these facilities, you might have been normal. But by the time you left, you were not. Because of the
that's true too.
abuse. And half of them had no teeth. They were sexually assaulted. They were, like you said, they were having their genitals burnt, and just all these horrible things happening to them. Shock therapy, their brains practically gone them because of the medication, and them cutting because they would do lobotomies and things on these people. And take out
shock treatments, lobotomies,
do certain things to people to see, like, well, if I poke this part of the brain, what will it do? What if I cut this part out? What will it do? And so there's a lot of things. So if you went in normal, you definitely did not leave normal by any means, because you were scarred one way or the other, physically, mentally, or emotionally,
Yeah, and like there was one guy when he became an adult, and I'll get to that part later, but he said that because all his teeth were pulled when his teeth came back in. He was a child when this happened, that his teeth were all crooked and stuff.
Oh, his second set came in?
Yeah. He was a child when they pulled his teeth, and of course, they were baby teeth. And of course, when his second set of teeth came in, they were crooked. They just didn't grow back right. And he had to have a lot of dental work to get his mouth corrected, because his teeth grew back in so bad that his jaw was kind of out of alignment.
Well, right.
And but like I said, those released under the streets. They just were not prepared for life outside of Tranquille. And Tranquille started off bad anyway, because Tranquille was actually the name of a Native Canadian chief. That when they bought the ground, they cheated him when they bought it to make the tuberculosis sanitarium.
They ripped him off, basically.
Yeah, and he ended up being murdered.
Whoa.
So actually, you know, even though the other place was maybe a better place, or the other use, even though it might have been a better use, it still was acquired under dubious dealings.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's how it always goes, too, though.
Yeah, really. And like I said, you know, the other 400, they were sent to other institutions, and the staff found employment elsewhere. And some of them, you know, went on to these other institutions. They just stayed in the mental health business.
Yeah.
In March of 2005, there was a class action lawsuit filed by former patients seeking compensation for the abuse that they endured. And that's how I found out about the guy that I just told you about. He was telling about when he was a child that they had pulled all of his teeth because he bit somebody one time.
I can see why you would beat somebody. He claims
he bit him in self-defense or something like that.
I believe that you would. You're being manhandled and strapped down, and you're trying to. I mean, who wouldn't want it to protect themselves or try to escape this type of condition? You do anything you can to. So I would bite somebody too.
And a lot of these patients that died, you know, their families weren't even notified. They just buried them. Took them out and buried them. And some of them, you know, I mean, it was children as well as adults. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it just, when it became a mental facility, that's when things really went downhill on this.
Did anybody get any money from the stuff, you know, because you said
this lawsuit was not only against Tranquille, but it was against 2 other institutions as well. Mm-hmm. So it included hundreds of people, hundreds. Mm-hmm. And it dragged on for years until finally the government set aside a few $1 million for restitution to keep the lawsuit out of the courts. But you have to remember, the amount that they set aside was not enough to pay everybody. And when you consider everybody that was in this class action lawsuit, and as of this date, I have found no reports where anyone received so much as a penny.
Typical.
Nobody has received any money from this class action lawsuit.
Yeah, they can hold that off for years and years and years and years and years and years, and keep going through the, you know, keep putting down paperwork to, you know, push it off until it never happens.
They did keep it going for years and years and years, and I think it was filed in like 2005, and I think it was like 2012 before this money was even set aside. So there you got, 7 years right there. And nobody has still been paid.
Right. They're good at doing that. Unless you got really good funds and a good legal team, then you might get it right away. But the fact is, they'll keep doing this paperwork. Nobody's ever going to get it. So.
And as far as I know, the class action lawsuit is still active. But I think it was a ploy by the government. You know, well, we'll set aside this amount of money, you know, for payment, for restitution, you know, trying to keep it out of the courts. But like I said, the problem is there was not enough money set aside. I think my opinion on that was it was just a token amount just to keep this going.
Right. They're just basically waiting for everybody to die off, or...
Well, that's what they do a lot of times, you know. They hope that you'll either give up or you'll die. Mm-hmm. And, like I said, you know, as of this date, no one has received a penny.
Right. So what's going on with the place now?
Okay, today the place is known as Tranquille Farm Fresh. And the new owners really have plans to turn...
It's called Farm Fresh?
Tranquille Farm Fresh.
Yeah, that's an interesting name.
They want to turn it into a farm, you know. Uh-huh. And they want to turn it into a spa and a place for artists. And from what I read, it sounds like they're trying to turn it into a commune.
Hippies? Nothing wrong with hippies, but like that's the best
nothing
way I
wrong
can
with hippies.
No, I'm just trying to grasp the picture. They're basically, it's like a spiritual get back to your roots, grow your own food, and
probably
relax.
I don't know what kind of a spa they want to turn it into. There are plans to demolish some of the buildings, but they want to save as many of the buildings as possible. Some of the buildings, have deteriorated to the point that they're not even safe anymore.
Why?
And
so because they don't take care of them.
Well, it sat empty for a lot of years,
But water damage, weather damage.
Yeah, it's sat empty since 1984.
And since basically people in chat were saying that area in Canada is kind of like a rainforest, I mean, I can see why there's a lot of damage.
Yeah. And plus, overgrowth and stuff like that. But the new owners do their best to maintain the buildings, the ones that are in really good shape that can be used. They do maintain them. Right now they're doing several things there. They have this tunnel theater. They have a walking tour where they give a history of the place, and they have a haunted corn maze. And they've even allowed a couple of paranormal investigation teams to go in there.
Someone said alternative retreat.
Yeah.
That's going to be basically what it's like. It's alternative retreat. It's offering different types of holistic and
thanks for that. Stuff. I couldn't think of that word.
Yeah, creature comfort. Thank you.
And that was the one I was looking for. Alternative. It's going to be an alternative retreat.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that they are running these tours and they have this theater down in the tunnel and all kinds of things going on right now to help pay to restore this place so they can, open it up for this.
Mm-hmm.
So at least they're doing something with it.
Yeah.
And we will post the link to that site. In our references, but it's called the Tranquille Farm Fresh. And this place is loaded with paranormal activity. Most, if not all, people, believe that it came from the days when it was a mental institution. In B Wing, for example, that's where the surgeries and the experiments were conducted, and it still holds most of the surgery equipment.
Oh wow! See, I bet you there's a lot of residual energy off of that type of equipment because of what's taking place to the people on there.
Exactly. There were reports of voices crying and screaming by unseen sources.
Yeah.
The room is cold all the time. They say that you just have an all-out feeling of doom when you go in there. You have the feeling of being watched. There have been apparitions in there, some residual.
Some you think is intelligent because it's interacting.
Some you think some people say that they had been touched. It's just they say that particular room is where most of the paranormal activity takes place.
In the surgery ward?
That is in the surgery ward. That is the hotbed of the paranormal activity at this place.
Mm-hmm.
The pediatric ward on the 8th floor, there are children and babies crying. And at one time, they actually switched and put the pediatric ward on another floor, and they put the Alzheimer's ward on the 8th floor. And during this time, when it was the Alzheimer patient ward, there were complaints, not only from the patients, of course they didn't pay attention to the patients, but from the staff, of babies crying all night long.
Okay, that's really pisses me off, because I can't stand that. Because first of all, they're screaming because anybody who knows, if you lay in a position too long, it hurts, okay? But we have the ability to turn and do other things. These infants are stuck like that. But, I mean, it's one thing to hear, okay, I hear abuse about people, but then when you start talking about little children and babies, it just really, it's so hard to hear and know that this is constantly happening. It's disgusting.
I don't know how anyone can sit and listen to a baby cry, or any child cry, all night long. I don't know how they could do it. Babies cry for reasons. When your baby cries, that baby's got a reason. It's hungry, it needs change, it needs to be repositioned. You know, I mean, there are reasons that babies cry. And to let one lay and cry all night, yeah, that pisses me off too. There's reports of an apparition of a woman on the 6th floor, and they said that she's believed to be a woman looking for her child, because she's said to be crying, and people have even reported that she seems to be looking for something. And I guess they assume that she's looking for her child. And the same apparition has also been seen on the 6th floor. And these were floors that were used for children. These particular floors.
I can see why they moved the old Alzheimer's patients up to the 8th floor, because it's easier to keep a track on them, because they tend to wander off. But it's still, you know, disgusting what happens into these facilities. Even company-ran facilities that aren't run by the government still treat people this poorly. And it's not just back then, it's still happening today. Don't fool yourself, you know? Just not, maybe not as intense, but it's still occurring, you know?
Right. In the basement, there is an apparition of a man down there, and they believe that he is the electrician that died down there. They didn't say for sure how this electrician died, but his apparition has been seen multiple times. Matter of fact, they said just about any time that they go down there, they run into him. Wow. But he seems to be residual. I couldn't find any reports where he has interacted with anyone.
Yeah, or unless he doesn't want to interact with anybody, you know. Maybe he doesn't know how to. Maybe they're trapped and they don't know how. Maybe they can't see people. Maybe they can't see the living anyway. Well,
that's a good theory. Excuse me. They also report voices and cold spots in the basement.
I could see the basement being cold anyway, because it's underground.
I can too. In the tunnels, there's the apparition of a nurse. And like I said, in the 1960s, there was a nurse killed down there by 2 inmates.
Yeah.
But there's also an apparition of another nurse. Now, the other nurse just seems... Both these nurses, actually, from what I read, they just seem to be wandering through. And one has been described as an older nurse, and then the nurse that they think is the one that was killed by the inmates is a younger woman. They say, I think she was something like in her 20s when she was murdered. They hear voices down there. They see orbs, cold spots. Like I said, the feeling of being watched. Are
there shadow entities things here too?
Yeah, there are shadow entities down there. There were literally hundreds of bodies, thousands of bodies actually transported through these tunnels. Because that's where they... Yeah.
But I don't believe they're like, oh, only this many people died during this operation. I call BS. Seriously. Because that's a lot of years and a lot of people coming
from
and
the time it opened until the time it closed, there was approximately 3,600 people that died here.
Yeah, I still think more. Sorry.
Could be. Could very well be.
Because of the fact that they would go after the staff and drug them and push them into another insane asylum just to shut them up means that they didn't keep good records, and they hid the fact that they probably caused a lot of deaths. But there's all and when we talk about this, we're not knocking.
Oh yeah, and in the children's ward, in the children's ward too, there's also an apparition of a nurse, and I'm wondering if it's that Miss White that was snatched up and sent to another facility.
But you said she escaped because her daughter got her out.
Well, she did escape. She didn't. I don't know what happened to her, but I mean, there's always reports of people in places that.
Yeah, but maybe she wasn't the only one. How do you know?
Could be.
Because you can only find so much information on the internet. Not everything's listed.
That's true, and that's a good point. If they did it to her, what's to say that they didn't do it to other nurses or other people that worked there and got away with it?
Right, and how many people could have been murdered?
It's just that hers was reported because her daughter went and got this lawyer. I think the lawyer's name was Stanton. Her daughter went and hired a lawyer, and then they went and got her. But they never did find out. They never did say how the daughter exactly found out what had happened to her mother.
Right. But all these things that are going on, with the Forced Sterilization Act, and it didn't just happen.
And there was another thing that happened there too. Yeah, when it was a mental facility, there was forced sterilization, and other things. And like you said, lobotomy, shock therapy,
weird nutritional experiments. I was reading about the different experiments that they were doing in Canada, and it wasn't just Canada; it was all over too. But like this way, I said we're going to do a show on this when it comes to the Sterilization Act and eugenics, or how do you say that word? Sorry, I forgot how to say it. But I didn't even know that happened here, and happened for years and years, and how Planned Parenthood came from this and everything else. But you would think, they're only doing it so that maybe people who didn't like a certain race, or it was just because of a disability. No, they were doing it to everybody, really. That's what I was finding out. They decided, because you know what one of their main push is because they didn't want to be responsible for everybody else. So let's just get rid of all these people. And all these people, I don't know. We'll talk more about it on the thing, but when I was studying the hospital that I talked about, and I'm sure you study in yours, it really opened our eyes up to a lot of things that I think a lot of us aren't aware of, that the government is continually doing to people to this day. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I can totally see why.
And they will do what they can. They will do what they can get away with. And it's like.
That's because nobody wants to believe that their government would do such a thing to them. But it's all there.
A lot of people don't believe it, but I'll tell you what, it does happen. It does happen. There's been other reports too that when that it doesn't matter what ward you walk through.
Yeah.
That I'm talking about the mental health, the one used for the mental health hospital.
Yeah.
There were reports that said it did not matter what ward you walked through, you would hear voices, and they were screaming and yelling and crying and begging for help. And it just a total feeling of sadness and despair. In some cases, there were touching, and the touching it wasn't somebody just coming up and touching you. They said the touching was rough. Like some people felt like they were being manhandled.
So maybe some old staff members or people who had mental...
right. And some people reported that after being touched, they would have bruises because they were pulled on. Not fondled, but like somebody would grab their arm and really pull on it roughly.
Oh, someone in chat's making another point, which does happen. We'll call her Cass. They were saying that also female patients would be pregnant because of staph and such, because of or organs or whatever, or because of other patients. So these babies, what did they do with her? What did they, you know what I mean? What happens? Did they abort them? They killed it, or did they?
Or they ended up in the pediatrics ward?
Or did they adopt them out and make money off it? Because there's a show we want to do that talks about doctors and nurses and mortuaries where they sell off body parts and other stuff. Like they take people's healthy organs, tell them it's not healthy, and then they up making a bank off of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there was a place in New York about 15 years ago that did that. The guy, I think he was a funeral director, and when bodies came in, he would take body parts and send them for like experiments or research or transplants. And he would put PVC pipe in these bodies to keep them from collapsing because he took so many body parts.
Right.
That was about, what, 15, 20 years ago.
But it's happening all the time. There, like I said, there's good and bad apples in everything, and there's dirty dealings happening all the time. But we're not knocking the good people, because there are good people who work their life away in hospitals just to make sure somebody else lives or survives. Yeah. And they try to speak up against the ill wills that are going on there. You know what I mean? But then there's also people on there that, you know, who do work in these places, who see people as nothing as just another number passing through. We don't care if you live or die, you know? Oh,
and there's also apparitions on the grounds, too, that have been reported, but these seem to be residual because these are, like, well-dressed, you know? So this may be residual from when it was a tuberculosis hospital. Wow. And the patients were well-treated because, I mean, when it became a mental facility, the people weren't really, the patients were not really allowed out of the building. They were kept in the wards.
Really? They had no air time, no outside time, no wander? Because you can put a big enough fence in with barbed wire. I mean, the freaking prison lets some people.
Yeah, but this was built up like a little city within a city, you know, like its own place.
Okay, so then they should still be able to go out and get some air or something.
Yeah, but... Well, you would think so, but a lot of them were over-medicated to control them, and they just sat around and drooled.
You give them enough Thorazine, you can roll them out in a wheelchair, and they'd still get fresh air.
Well, you would think so, but they're not going to do that. But it's reported that anywhere you go on this property, there is some sort of paranormal activity.
You know...
And the place is open for tours.
Yeah, but it makes you wonder, like, what's going to happen now that these facilities are being changed into other things. You know, like, okay, the Camsell Hospital, if it's going to be these different apartment condos.
I want to tell you something. That Camsell Hospital, if they turn that into apartments, I would never live there.
Well, you don't live in Canada anyway. I don't think Canada
would let you in there.
I don't live in Canada
anyway, but if I did, Canada probably wouldn't let me in.
No,
if they did, they wouldn't have me there for long. But even I don't care. Yeah, even if I did live up there. There is no way in the world I would live in one of those apartments.
Yeah.
No way.
But it makes you wonder.
We had a place down here that was a mental facility, and they turned it into condos. Mm-hmm. There's no way I would live there. And the thing about that is that when people move in, they don't stay long.
Yeah, that's the turn rate. It's like. The doors, you know, you don't even unlock.
And they don't sell them, you rent them, you know.
But there's people who are going to want to move into that Camsell Hospital because
sure there are.
They're paranormal enthusiasts. So, of course, they're like, well, you know. But I don't think I could live in that type of place. Okay, sure, there's haunted places. Other haunted places, I probably wouldn't mind so much. But to move into a facility place that did such horrific things to people... I don't think I could handle that.
I don't mind living with spirits. I've lived with them all my life. Okay?
You're not talking about the ones in the bottle either.
No, I'm not. I would never, ever, ever move into a condo or an apartment into a place that was once a mental facility.
Yeah, I don't think I could.
There is no way.
There's this place called...
You're talking about a whole new group of spirits.
There's this place there's a few places that they tear them down all over the place, but there was this place in... dang it, now I forgot the county. Okay, but it's kind of out in the countryside. But this guy ended up purchasing the old... facility that was used as an insane asylum, and after the government shut down everything else, and like, you know, we talked about these places, they just tossed you out and goodbye, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And these people didn't know where to go and stuff, but people kept breaking into this building, this facility, and, you know, they would get hurt or whatever, so he ended up eventually having the place tore down. But every time you drive down that road or you go by it, anybody can practically feel their energy. It's almost like you look and you'll see all these people just standing on the road or standing on the side of the road and just wandering the grounds. You can literally feel them. It's that intense. And I don't ever claim to be like psychic or do all this stuff or whatever, but that one place, you can definitely feel them, the energy. It's so intense. And it's not just me, my friends and other people, and not even knowing at the time that this place was there. You know, we saw things and felt it, and that's why what made me research to find out what that building was, and that's how I found out it was. But
there are a lot of places like that. I went to the Little Bighorn, and I didn't stay long because the spirits kept crowding me. They just kept crowding me, and it got to the point that I just felt like I couldn't breathe, and I had to leave.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to see that place. But there are places like that they're just so full of that energy and those spirits that and if you're really sensitive to them, you can't, you just have to leave.
Yeah.
That you can't stay there.
No.
That's like ground zero. The same thing happened.
Yeah.
It was just a feeling of being suffocated and just absolutely could not breathe.
Like everything's in your... Exactly. And it's just like this weird energy. But that, I guess, happens in a lot of places where such traumatic things are occurring. And with the place that I talked about, you know, being kidnapped, taken away from your family, never returned, forced to transition into different languages, learning different languages and belief systems, and having your name taken from you, and, you know, having all this abuse happen to you and all the other things, you know, I can see why that place is jacked up.
Cassandra made a good point, you know. She says it's a very different energy, and it is. It's a very different energy. It's not like you go into a place, you know, where a family lived there, and when they passed, they loved the place so much they didn't want to leave. That that is a different kind of energy from when you go to a place where something really traumatic happened, where there's a lot of negative energy, when there's something really horrendous happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just absolutely a different energy.
Yeah. Do you want to wrap up, or is there anything more you want to talk about on this? Or
no, we've pretty much covered it, and I want to thank the person who sent in that request, because I'll tell you what, I would have never ever researched that without that request, and I think I think she sent it in twice.
Yeah, for the Camsell. Two or
for
three
the Camsell Hospital.
Yeah.
It was eye-opening. It really was, and thank you very much for sending in that request.
Right, because when we started doing our research, it brought us down so many different avenues and opened our eyes to so many things that we were unaware of, and I think a lot of other people aren't aware of this stuff, so it's definitely inspired
It even led to things that was happening in the United States. I mean, it just seemed like they were all connected.
Yeah, that's the weird thing when you start researching and everything else. You really come across a lot of things, but just the ill treatment that happened to people, and the whole complete genocide that almost happened in Canada and everywhere else, it sickens us. But we appreciate you guys. We really enjoyed catching part of the chat. They were very, very talking a lot, and was amazing things that they were saying. I wish I could read it all, but I couldn't. But why don't you go ahead and let people know what we'll be doing next, I guess. I don't know. Well,
I want to thank everybody for coming in. I want to thank our mods, Richard, Nail, Alex, Doppel. Thank you for a good job. Thank you, Raven, for a good show. Join us Tuesday, May 1st, 2018 at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We got another viewer's quest that we are looking at, and it's going to be something cryptid. It's going to be cryptid, people.
You're turning into me. Don't send them no emus, you know?
Yeah, really. It's going to be on a cryptid. We are getting requests for more cryptids, and I think we got one picked out, and we're kind of bouncing another one off of each other. So come chat and listen when we discuss this. It is a viewer's request. Thank you for coming. please subscribe to us, give us a like, and share us with others on any social media site you may be a part of.
Right. And we want to thank you guys all for coming. If there's anybody who ever listens who wants to come on and do a paranormal, what do we call it? Paranormal chat? Paranormal talk night? Where we invite...
You know what? We haven't had a paranormal talk night for a while, and we're about due for one.
Yeah. So if there's anybody who listens to our show who's had their own paranormal experiences, have photos, EVPs, or whatever that they would like to share with us and others, go ahead and reach out to us in an email. And we'd love to do another one of those. But if you guys want to get show reminders, you can either click down here on our YouTube next to our spooky raven name and get YouTube reminders, or you can go to our website, anythingbutordinary2.wix.com/anythingbutordinary, and you can sign up for an weekly I knew something was going to happen. Weekly email reminders for our live shows on YouTube, or you guys can contact us there with show ideas or friendly banter or whatever. We hope you guys have an amazing week, and we'll see you at our next show. Good night.
Good night.